Hello, and welcome to Mile High JACL's 2021 Day of Remembrance. We honor this day so that we never forget how the signing of Executive Order 9066 imprisoned Japanese Americans and how its effects still reverberate today. My name is Dylan Morey, and this might be the first time many of you have had the chance to meet me. I've been the president of the Mile High chapter of JACL for the past year, and I'm thrilled and honored to be here today presenting DOR 2021 to you all. We have an incredible and powerful program for you today. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the indigenous ancestral lands that many of us are on today. Since our program is virtual, we realize that some of you may be tuning in from all over the world, but for those of us in Colorado, we sit on the land of the Arapaho, Ute, Cheyenne, Sioux, and Apache tribes, who have lived on this land for centuries and continue to live here. No matter where you might be tuning in from right now, I hope you take some time and honor with gratitude your own land and the indigenous people who act as stewards of it. This program today was made possible by a grant from the Nisei Veterans Heritage Foundation, administered by Simpson United Methodist Church and the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, along with the Sakura Foundation. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors who helped make this event possible. We'd like to thank our usual hosts as well, History Colorado Center, who are joining us virtually. The JACL is the country's oldest Asian American and Pacific Islander civil rights organization, founded in 1929. The Mile High chapter of the JACL has been an active civil rights and educational organization in Colorado since 1938. We are very proud of our history and our support for the JA community here in Colorado and throughout the nation. I also wanted to take some time and recognize some of our community partners. If we were meeting in person, we'd have tables set up for the DU Amashi Project, the National Park Service, Asian Pacific Development Center, the Japanese American Resource Center of Colorado, and the US Census. If you'd like to get on our chapter's mailing list, go ahead and drop your email in the Google form in the chat. And if you'd like to join JACL to help us continue our work and our fight for social justice and education, you can do so through our website or the JACL National website. Today, Mile High JACL needs your help to continue to provide informative and amazing programming along with scholarships for the next generation. Anytime today, if you feel so inclined, we ask that you take a moment and visit our website at milehighjacl.org and make a donation. Your donation will go a long way towards allowing us to continue to secure and maintain the civil rights of Japanese Americans and all others who are victimized by injustice and bigotry, and to promote cultural, educational, and social values and preserve the heritage and legacy of the Japanese American community. So this is our first ever virtual Day of Remembrance. And for those of you at home who might not have ever been on a stream like this before, we do have a chat feature in our YouTube stream. We want all of you to share your thoughts throughout the course of this event in hopes that it might feel a little more like we're all meeting in person. So please don't be shy and go ahead and post in the chat. But I want to let everyone know that we do have moderators in the chat that are there to prevent any bad activity. And on that note, I'd like to thank everyone who's helping out today. Although you can't see us, there's a team of volunteers on the other side of the screen helping everything run smoothly today. Now I have a request from the audience. For any attendees who were incarcerated during World War II, please sound off and type something in the chat. Your name, the concentration camp where you were imprisoned, and any other details you'd like to provide. And if someone in your family was incarcerated, please also type something in the chat. And I'd like to say from all of us to you, thank you for being here today. Now, if there's anyone here who was a veteran of the 442nd Infantry Regiment or the Military Intelligence Service during World War II, also, we'd like to hear from you in the chat. Please type something. And if there are any veterans of the US military since World War II here today, please also sound off in the chat. And thank you for your service. So I never got a chance to meet my grandfather, and there's a lot of things I would have liked to have asked him. Did you feel angry or scared when they forced you and your family and your parents out of your home in Sacramento? When you arrived at this place, this camp called Tule Lake, what was it like? Did you feel like you had any hope at all for a better future for you and your family? Your dream of becoming an architect and attending college and your scholarship, those were all taken away from you. I'm sure that many of your families have stories of your own that you've heard many times. Or maybe some of you wish you had a chance to hear those stories. Whether our families lived through wartime incarceration or not, our shared history is a powerful one. And only by shedding light on this shameful time in history can we begin to move forward and say, never again. And then maybe we can mend the wounds and the trauma that was caused by incarceration and still exist within us. When I took the reins as Mile High's president last year, I was nervous, but I was excited. I was looking forward to a year of advocacy, education, and activism. Well, about a month after last year's Day of Remembrance, I got an email at work telling all of us that we'd be working from home until further notice. We had all heard of this new coronavirus that had originated in the Wuhan province in China and was making its way throughout the world. But I think few of us could really grasp how much of our world would change because of it, how upended our lives would become. It seems like overnight, everything we knew changed. Some jobs became work from home jobs, other jobs were just lost forever. School became distant, which made it even harder for a lot of families to cope. We missed birthdays, anniversaries, celebrations, traditions, grieving, becoming hyper aware of how often we washed our hands, touched our faces, got within 6 feet of people. How fragile things like our health, our finances, our well-being really were. Many of us, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, also had to carry the burden of being blamed for the spread of the virus, given its origin in China. The ignorance and fear around COVID led to xenophobic ugliness, insults, and even sometimes physical aggression directed at us. For many of us, it didn't feel like there was much we could do except wait for things to get better. Even with a vaccine on the horizon, the future seemed, and still seems, uncertain. But soon, we had to reckon with another emergency facing our country. When the world saw the footage from Minneapolis of George Floyd's brutal murder at the hands of police, it became a rallying cry for the fight against police brutality and systemic racism. That anger and those demands for justice spread, and it soon became the largest protest in our nation's history. Millions of people filled the streets in cities, in suburbs, and in rural areas, all to rise up and say, Black Lives Matter. And it showed the power of solidarity. When we stand up and say, your fight is our fight too. Seeking a future of justice, reconciliation, and Black liberation is going to be a long journey and difficult work, but it's more necessary now than ever before. As I speak to you all today, it's important to recognize that all of us are still here. But it's hard to celebrate that when it's been such a year full of loss. But I do sincerely hope that this year of loss leads into years of possibility. Years where we can live our lives with dignity and respect and demand that as a right, not a privilege. Where we can live our lives without oppression from the most powerful and privileged among us. And that's part of why the JACL's mission is still so important to me. It's easy to look back in the past at violations of human rights, at historical tragedies, and to condemn them. But it's sometimes less easy to look around at the injustices of today and realize that a lot of the same fights are still going on. And building a better world starts at the grassroots level, to challenge institutions of power and to create a world that values our humanity and freedom. It's organizations like the JACL that I believe can lead the fights going forward, working towards justice and equality and demanding accountability from those in power, all the way up to the highest office in the country, whether the person leading that office is Donald Trump or whether that person is Joe Biden. So I've spoken a lot today, but this day isn't just about me. Now it's time to hear from all of you. So we put together a video message from several leaders in our Denver community. Please enjoy.
Hello everyone, I'm Gary Yamashita, and I'm a board member of the Mile High chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. Thank you for joining us for this observance of the Day of Remembrance, which commemorates the signing of Executive Order 9066. I'm hopeful that this year will be one of listening, learning, and understanding to build a nation that cares about diversity, equality, and inclusion.
Hi, my name is Courtney Ozaki. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a board member for the Mile High JACL. And where I'm currently finding resilience is in the memory of my grandparents, both sides of my family, which were incarcerated during World War II, and then traveled to Denver in order to create opportunity and better lives for our family, and just the ability for me to carry on their legacy through my commitment to work with our community and also to work with other communities to lift them up and lift up one another together.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Ujakala. I use she, her pronouns, and I hope that in 2021 we remember how to be empathetic and care about each other again.
Hi, I'm Tom. Pronouns he, him. With the COVID-19 pandemic wreaking havoc in our lives for this past year, at least now there's light at the end of the tunnel. Number 1, stay positive. Number 2, get that vaccine. Make sure you wear your mask. Social distance. With any luck, we'll be able to see you soon. Stay safe.
Hello everyone, my name is Clarence Lowe. I serve on the board of directors of the Asian Chamber of Commerce. I regret that we cannot meet this year, but I wish you and your family all the best. I look forward to a brighter year and when we can meet again.
I'm Stacy Shigaya. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And on this day of remembrance, I'm thinking of my parents, Doug and Ruby Sagara. They were both interned during World War II. And in honor of them, my hope for 2021 is that we all value each other more, that we value truth, justice, compassion, honesty, and that we all do our little part to make the world a better place. Everything adds up, and if we all just try a little bit each day, things are going to get better.
Hi, my name is Margaret Ozaki Graves, and I go by Meg. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. My hope for 2021 is that as a country and society, we gain a deeper acceptance of those who are different from us and learn from the difficult lessons of the past year.
Hello, I'm Richard Hamani. I'm a board member of the Mile High JACL. The Day of Remembrance is very meaningful to me. During World War II, my father and his family were incarcerated at the Minidoka American concentration camp in Idaho. My father was only 10 years old. He and his parents never spoke about their life at Minidoka. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and my schools never mentioned the Japanese American concentration camps during the war. It wasn't until I joined the JACL in the 1990s that I learned about them and why they happened. Commemorating the Day of Remembrance reminds us how fragile our constitutional rights can be when our leaders chose to ignore the rights of their citizens based solely on the color of their skin. And last year, in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the divisiveness created by President Trump and his administration, shows us just how far we as a nation have yet to go. When you compare the civil rights movement in the 1960s to what happened in 2020, it almost seems like nothing has changed. Racism and bigotry are still here. And there are people who deny facts and the truth, which is why we must never take things for granted and should always be vigilant to protect our rights. Best wishes, and here's hoping to building a better America starting in 2021.
Hello, my name's Derek Okubo. My pronouns are he, his, and him. I'm the Executive Director for the Agency for Human Rights and Community Partnerships for the City and County of Denver. Normally, we would be convened together to remember the tragedy that was Executive Order 9066. But as we all know, normal was just thrown right out the window. However, 2021 does bring hope. And that we do, for the first time in a while, see light at the end of the tunnel. And personally, I look forward to a time soon where I can finally hug my 90-year-old mom, who is a survivor of the Minidoka concentration camp, and hold her close for the first time in 1 year. And that same wish I share with all of you, that you will soon be able to share time with your loved ones, your friends, and to be able to head back to some type of normalcy that we previously took for granted. So to 2021 and to all of you, ganbatte. We're almost there. Hang in there, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the very near future.
Now, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Na Vuong Sandoval. Na's been a staple in the Denver community for her entire life, and she has an incredible life story and resume. Na and her family fled their homeland in Vietnam due to the Vietnam War and became refugees. They were displaced in refugee camps before resettling in the US. Now she serves as the Refugee Congress Delegate for Colorado, a TEDx presenter, a founding member and public speaker with the Colorado Refugee Speakers Bureau, the first refugee elected to Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountains Board of Directors, a Noble Ambassador for Christina Noble Children's Foundation, a Denver's Little Saigon Redevelopment Group Advisory member, and a Denver Elections Advisory Committee member. She previously served as a commissioner with the Denver Asian American Pacific Islander Commission. She's partnered with Stories Without Borders, Refugee Council USA, and Church World Services and provided storytelling, public speaking, and advocacy training to refugee and immigrant leaders across the US. She provided migrant training for NPR News, Morning Edition, StoryCorps. Her scholarly book reviews are published in the Oxford University Press. She publishes op-eds on medium.com on race, culture, social justice, her refugee experience, and current social issues. Na publicly spoke at the Proclamation Day for Colorado World Refugee Day, the Women's March on Denver, and the Family Belong Together rally. She testified on Senate Bill 2030, Colorado Refugee Services Program at the Colorado legislation that was codified into law. She lobbied at Capitol Hill to members of the US Congress in support of the US Refugee Admissions and Resettlement Program. Her story and interviews have been featured in Colorado Public Radio, Denver Center for the Performing Arts, Denver Post, Westward, Denverite, KUSA 9 News, CBS 4 News, History Colorado, Denver Arts and Venues, WMFDP Insider Outsider Podcast, and Confluence Magazine. Na was recently honored with a mural for her tireless social justice advocacy work by renowned artist and muralist Thomas Eben that is located in the historic Five Points neighborhood here in Denver. If you haven't gotten a chance to see it yet, it's very cool. Go check it out. We are so lucky to have Na with us today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to DOR 2021, Na Vuong Sandoval.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am humbled and honored to be with you today on such a significant day for Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, and all who have been impacted by these injustices of this day. Let me take you on a journey. It's about a toddler girl who fled from her homeland due to the Vietnam War. It's about a young woman who learned about the history that's rarely or never presented in schools. It's about a young woman who felt compelled to uncover these injustices and turned her knowledge, distress, and outrage to educate others in order to ensure that the lives of people of color and underrepresented and marginalized communities are improved. It's about a woman who saw the strength of solidarity. It's about a woman who believes in the power of resistance and advocacy. Let me take you on my journey. The day that my family and I fled our homeland, we left everything that we knew, our home, our language, the people that we knew, our country that we knew, everything. We fled our homeland due to an oppressive and unjust and corrupt government. There was political unrest, and the brutal communist regime and armies plowed through our streets, annihilated our neighborhoods and homes. Families were separated with no guarantee of ever being reunited. We were considered the lucky ones who managed to escape this treacherous journey, only to begin our new journey. We left on a ramshackled cargo ship, heading to unknown destinations, and we finally arrived on a refugee camp where we finally found safety for my family and I. President Gerald Ford delivered this message on May 7th, 1975, before the arrival of Vietnamese refugees that included my family and I. He said, "The United States has had a long tradition of opening its doors to immigrants from all countries. We're a nation built by immigrants. Out of the 120,000 refugees who are here or who are on their way here, 60% of those are our children. They ought to be given an opportunity. And I'm convinced that the vast majority of Americans today want these people to have another opportunity to escape the probability of death. Therefore, I applaud those who feel this way. I'm appreciative of the fact that the US had a president at the time who was compassionate of the plight of refugees and allowed us entry into our new home. Looking back at my experience as a refugee, I gained very valuable lessons about myself and from others. Most important are the lessons that I gained from complete strangers. You see, being a newcomer in a new country required that my parents accept any job available. It required that they find stable housing as quickly as possible. It also required us to learn English as quickly as possible. My parents encouraged me to listen and obey my teachers, be studious, and a good student. As a child back then, I didn't understand the complex concept of xenophobia and racism, or how unpopular the Vietnam War was, how we were viewed as a burden to many Americans. I didn't know at the time that the opposition that Americans had on allowing Vietnamese refugees into the United States was actually higher than what it is today towards Syrian refugees. But the most important thing that my parents instructed me was to keep my head down and to not draw any attention to ourselves. After all, we lost our country. We were now in a foreign nation, one that was far away from anything that we recognized. When I began grade school, I abided my parents' guidance and instructions to be obedient, But I believe I was being even beyond obedient because I found that I could excel in this environment. Without speaking any English when I arrived to the United States, I earned honor roll every single semester of school and received various academic awards throughout my formal education. You may not know this, but I even became class president in grade school. Later on, upon entering college, I had the fortune of having such inspiring professors who introduced me and assisted me into exploring history in the way that I never have. We engaged in meaningful and thoughtful dialogue. And for the very first time, I saw American history through the lens of the oppressed, the marginalized, those who have been silenced for far too long. I learned about Indigenous history and broken treaties, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Angel Island, the Holocaust, Executive Order 9066, and the Japanese internment camps. I learned about the Chicano movement, the Civil Rights Movement, the United Farm Workers Movement, and the very complicated history of the Vietnam War. As a young college student, I realized that what I was reading in books and what my family and I were experiencing since we were newcomers was still occurring in our day-to-day. Because I saw that individual rights were being infringed. I witnessed people of color being scapegoated and treated unequal to those in the dominant society. Racism and xenophobia appeared regularly toward people of color, refugees, and immigrants. Women were being paid unequally. There were discriminatory hiring practices. And I witnessed refugees and immigrants being unwelcomed and denied entry into the United States. Quickly, I became involved through internships and I volunteered to assist vulnerable communities, including feeding the homeless population, assisting terminally ill children, and I joined student groups that uplifted issues that impacted different communities, including Asians and people of color. What that did was it increased my awareness and engagement with issues surrounding civil rights. But in the process, I continue to witness social injustices that were being televised regularly on major news networks. I saw police brutality in the Rodney King case and race riots erupting due to systems that failed to deliver justice. I observed bombings at places of worship, at churches and mosques. And when the NAFTA agreement was enacted, nationalism increased, where countries and people and groups of people were being scapegoated for loss of jobs. And as we witnessed from Hurricane Katrina, the US's failing infrastructure was on display for the entire country to observe. And we also saw the impacts and the detrimental impact that it had to communities that were poor. I observed the increase and influx of undocumented immigrants. And of course, the entire world watched during 9/11 and the rise of Islamophobia. But in addition to seeing media coverage, I also began to learn about incredible Asian Americans who've stood up against oppression, injustices, and inequalities. Fred Korematsu was one of the most iconic Asian civil rights figures of the time. And it's extremely important for everyone to know, especially those unfamiliar with internment camps, World War II, and the history of Japanese Americans in this country, that his story dispels the notion that Asian Americans never fought for our civil rights. And despite the fact that he was a US citizen, it didn't safeguard him from being arrested for refusing to be relocated to an internment camp in 1942. He challenged the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, the decree that forced the relocation of people of Japanese descent to internment camps. The court actually ruled in favor of the government and against Korematsu. It was only after World War II when he was finally released from prison, but his conviction remained on his record for 40 years until it was finally overturned in 1983. Despite all of that, he continued to promote civil rights for his entire life, not just calling on government agencies to make amends to Japanese Americans, but he also wanted to ensure that his own experience served as a reminder of the importance of preserving liberties and civil liberties for all. After the 9/11 attacks, he spoke out to remind the nation of the dangers of racial profiling. And he drew parallels between what happened then in 1940 with the profiling of Japanese Americans, with the stereotyping of Muslims. And he even filed 2 amicus briefs to the Supreme Court in 2003. And a message that Korematsu often preached was, he called for peaceful action. And his message and determination still resonates with me today. He said, protest, but with not violence. And don't be afraid to speak up. One person can make a difference, even if it takes 40 years. Another Asian American hero is Mabel Lee, who was a Chinese immigrant. She was a steadfast advocate for women's rights and for the greater Asian American community. Her life is the epitome of breaking down barriers, countless barriers, at a time when women had very few opportunities. It was at a time when Chinese migration to the US was largely banned under the Chinese Exclusion Act. But you know what? She refused to be a wallflower. She gave speeches, she wrote articles, and helped lead a 10,000 strong march through the streets of New York City. This all occurred when she was just a teenager. In 1914, she wrote an article that giving women the right to vote was nothing more than a wider application of our ideas of justice and equality, and that suffrage was extending democracy to women. She marched alongside women of all races who were fighting for women's voting rights. And while women won the right to vote in 1920, she wouldn't be able to exercise this right to vote due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it should be noted that the centennial day of celebration for the suffragette movement is only for some women, not everyone, because it wasn't until 1943, not 1920, that Chinese American women were finally given the right to citizenship and the right to vote. Grace Lee Boggs is an activist and an advocate who spent much of her life advocating for civil rights and labor rights. She became a noted figure in Detroit's Black Power movement, although she was Asian, that some people even assume that she was, or must be, partially Black. She became the city's most noted activist during that time, She tackled issues related to labor and civil rights, feminism, Black power, Asian Americans, and the environment. Though many of her ideas centered around revolution and the abilities of our own self to transform his or her own world rather than overthrowing a system. She believed in using nonviolence in protests, and she believed in using reflection instead of an automatic response. Grace Lee Boggs said, "I don't know what the next American Revolution is going to look like, but we might be able to imagine it if your imagination was rich enough." And another civil rights activist that is rarely spoken about is Larry Etienne. When I mention the name Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, most people recognize and revere who he is and his work because they were widely known for the great strike of farm workers and migrant workers during the 1960s. And it prompted that international boycott of table grapes. But there's a movement behind that history that's rarely told, and it traces back to Delano, California, a predominantly farm community. Pay cuts were threatened, and workers were prepared to act. Etienne was instrumental in sparking the Delano grape strike in 1965, as he gathered and organized over 1,500 Filipino laborers to demand better pay and working conditions from growers. On September 7th, 1965, that night, farm workers, who were almost all Filipino, voted to go on strike the next day. Etienne he reached out to Cesar Chavez, who at the time was a leader of another labor movement. Cesar Chavez and others had been organizing Mexican workers around Delano for years. However, a strike wasn't in their immediate plans. Etienne appealed to Chavez, and 2 weeks later, Mexican workers joined forces, creating what we know today as the United Farm Workers of America. This launched a series of boycotts and marches that eventually led to agreements for better wages and protections of farm workers in the 1970s. It took 5 years of striking, plus an international boycott of table grapes, before growers signed contracts with the United Farm Workers. And for decades, Filipino farm workers called manongs or elders have been working towards this goal. Asian Americans and Filipinos in particular are outraged that this history isn't known, about how Filipinos took action to provide for the lives of so many. And while they were proud that Cesar Chavez was the right public figure at the right time, much of the work had already been done by Filipino farm workers and organizers. In 2015, former Governor Jerry Brown signed 2 pieces of legislation, one to designate October 5th as Larry Etienne Day, which is also his birthday, and the second requiring that educational institution teach his legacy and history. I observed back then that even since the time that these Asian civil rights activists had been involved with these movements and gained traction and made improvements to the lives of many, I still saw that rights continued to be infringed. Xenophobia persisted. Certain communities were denied access and rights, and those seeking safety were still being denied. Immigrants were being detained just for seeking a better life. I asked myself the question, How can I use my voice and experiences to bolster and further the causes of others on a broader scale? So since the onset of my advocacy, I was naturally drawn to issues and causes that were nearest and closest to my heart. Immigration, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people, which, by the way, happens to also be the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. I wanted to amplify voices of humans impacted by unjust laws and policies. I want to dismantle these racist systems that cause inequities and oppression. I saw that immigration wasn't just a Vietnamese or an Asian issue. It impacted many, many, many different communities. And I wanted to use my experience to advocate for all, not just one particular group. I want to share some of these moments of my advocacy and how I use this perspective in order to further these causes. In 2017, I spoke on the Colorado Capitol steps on the proclamation of Colorado World Refugee Day. I wanted to ensure that all refugee voices were represented and heard. I wanted to make refugees visible, not just for our past contributions, but also to highlight our future impact. And when I recognized the power of storytelling and advocacy and how it can be amplified beyond Colorado, I was selected and became involved with Refugee Congress as the Refugee Congress delegate for Colorado, the only advocacy organization that's led by refugees and immigrants throughout the nation. And I worked alongside refugees and immigrant leaders across the United States for a unified cause. Just a couple years ago, when the presidential determination for the number of refugees allowed into the United States was set as historic lows by the previous administration, I lobbied as the only refugee, along with the Colorado delegation, on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. A presidential determination was about to be set that year, following a historic low of 18,000 allowed from the previous year. And keep in mind, the US has traditionally and historically welcomed 120,000 each year since 1980. I spoke to Republican members of Congress in order to ensure that they understood the detriment of denying refuge for those fleeing war, persecution, famine, and violence. Much of a surprise to many of us, this resulted in a ranking member, a Republican ranking member of Congress, leading a sign-on letter with the support of over 20 of his Republican colleagues in support of our recommendations. In another instance, when I learned about the effects of Agent Orange, about how it still has profound effects on those in Vietnam today, particularly upon children and impoverished families. And I found out that these extremely toxic biochemical agents remained in the ecosystem that cause astounding physical, physiological, and psychological damage to children and families in need. I became involved with the Christina Noble Children's Foundation that was founded by an extraordinary woman who overcame tremendous adversity, yet she poured her trauma into assisting those from my homeland and in Mongolia. So I used my personal refugee story and experience and knowledge about these issues that I cared about, and I became a Noble ambassador for the Christina Noble Children's Foundation. But I also utilized these experiences to speak at conferences, rallies, panels, media interviews, podcasts, and the one-on-one conversations. I wanted to ensure that every single person who seeks safety and refuge from all ethnicities, from all communities, are afforded the same opportunity as I was. There are many valuable lessons that I've learned from my own advocacy. And without a doubt, Asians and Asian Americans have played a significant role in the civil rights movements and resistance. Through their experience and my advocacy, I've learned that advocacy isn't just significant, it's absolutely necessary. And it's not just about advocating for groups of people that we look like or that we identify with. It's about advocating for all who are negatively impacted by the same issues. Solidarity is imperative because it shows a unified message. It shows that our concerns and issues extend beyond the communities that are closest to us. We all need to remember that advocacy speaks not only about who we are, but even more important, who we want to be. Let's never forget about the lives of the 120,000 Japanese Americans and their families by honoring them, whose lives and families have been forever changed due to xenophobic and racist mindsets and laws. We need to call out injustices when we see and hear it. We need to dismantle inhumane laws that dehumanize people. Let's remember that injustices can happen anywhere. We need to ensure that the legacies of those who risk everything are being honored and continued by civil rights giants like Fred Korematsu, Mabel Lee, Grace Boggs, Larry Itulong, and countless Asian Americans who stood alongside Blacks, Mexicans, Muslims, and white communities. We've seen that constitutional rights and liberties continue to be encroached and violated. So we must stand against social inequalities, and we must resist. In the words of Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, she says that we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. So first off, thank you again to Na for that really amazing speech that she gave for our DOR this year. She's going to be joining us in just a second for our next portion of the talk, which is our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for her, please post them in the chat on the YouTube stream, and one of our volunteers will get them to us, so she'll get a chance to answer them. So we'll move into that session very shortly. But first, I had a couple of things I just wanted to say before we did. So the first part of the Day of Remembrance this year was pre-recorded, and I wanted to give a shout out to one of our community members, Keiko Ozaki, who is a video editor. She put together that entire video because she wanted to help share these community stories. So thank you, Keiko, for that work. Another thing I wanted to bring up was that we got contacted by the office of Governor Jared Polis, and they sent us a letter that I'd like to read. I'd like to read for you all right now about today. It's a little bit wordy, so just bear with me. So, to the Mile High chapter of the JACL, I appreciate the opportunity to join you in marking and observing this important annual Day of Remembrance. While I know we all wish this day of community, reflection, and future vision could be held in person, I'm heartened that the momentum of efforts to bring attention to these events and the resolve of all gathered today has carried it forward virtually. The inexcusable incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans is undoubtedly one of the darkest injustices in our nation's history, and the Amachi site makes this injustice a deep personal part of Colorado's history. Amachi was a unique site for many reasons, with the distinction of having the most Japanese American volunteers to enlist in the military, and in having a rare voice of opposition to the concentration camp in former Governor Ralph L. Carr. Few leaders during that period had the courage to speak out against this atrocity. As the governor of Colorado at the time, Carr stood alone among Western political leaders by taking a strong and public stand against the mass incarceration. These unconstitutional atrocities must never be forgotten, and in many instances, their unfortunate legacy continues today. It is tragic that many first-generation survivors of the incarceration camps died before receiving reparations. We know that societal injustices can reverberate through generations, which is why Amachi and this Day of Remembrance aren't simply vestiges of the past, but have a valuable role in the present day and on into the future. Because of this, I look forward to working with the incoming Biden administration to designate Amachi as a national park site for the education, healing, and growth of generations to come. In Colorado, we are fortunate to have 12 national park units that we cherish for their natural, historic, cultural, and economic significance. In the spirit of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, preserving and protecting the Amachi site presents a valuable opportunity to achieve the critical goal of enhancing the NPS mission to interpret and interrogate our past and tell a more complete story of our state and nation. Great nations can make terrible mistakes, but it is only through the acknowledgement of their terrible mistakes, the learning from and rectification of these mistakes, that nations can achieve true greatness. By preserving Amachi and similar sites, we promote healing and reconciliation on not only a national level, but on personal and community levels as well. I look forward to joining all of you as we work not only to mark the past of Amachi, but also to chart its invaluable future. Sincerely, Jared Polis, Governor. So thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank the staff who got the letter to us, Jonathan Asher and Vanessa Mazal. Thank you very much for that. So with those announcements out of the way, let's move on to the Q&A session. So let's bring Na onto the call. Hey, Na, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. Good, how are you?
Doing great. Still very just like blown away by the talk you gave just now. I hadn't got a chance to see it until I was waiting for today to see it. And again, I'd like everyone to, if you have any questions for Na, please put them in the chat and we will get them to her. But I guess just to start out, I had a few questions. And so I noticed through the whole talk, there was a big focus on ways that while you mentioned while you were growing up, you didn't necessarily learn about the injustices that America was responsible for in places like school, and rather you learned it from your own lived experiences and what was going on in the world around you at the time. And I know a lot of people in the chat could probably relate to that in terms of the incarceration experience, where it might not have been mentioned in school, or it would maybe had a paragraph or two in our history books. So I'm curious, when you think about the role of people like educators, what do you think their role should be when describing things like the incarceration or like the Vietnam War or any other atrocities that have happened throughout the years?
That's a great question. I first of all want to thank the Mile High JACL for having me. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I have the utmost respect for all of the impact and all of the education and just the legacy of every contribution that has been made by your community highlighted. So I appreciate being here. I'm humbled, and it's a huge honor. It's a huge honor to be here to remember this important day with all of you. In response to your question, I think it's a very valid question, and it's a question I feel still has a lot of, there's a lot of work surrounding education that needs to be done. I don't think it's the fault of course, the students during your early years of education or even as early adulthood, because the curriculum has been set already. It's been set by those who are making these decisions and who are keeping the status quo, basically. To give you an example, the first time that I had learned about the Japanese internment camps, it was because I went out of my way to try to learn more about a piece of history that was never even mentioned. You hear all about Pearl Harbor and you hear about the war, but you don't hear the humanitarian side of it. As with the Vietnam War, you hear about how the US went in and quote unquote, Vietnam won, but did we? Because I don't feel like we won. And I don't feel as though the complexities of it had been even remotely examined in the fact that when they say Vietnam, do they mean communist Vietnam? Do they mean the South, the civilians like us? Because there's multiple dimensions of this very, very controversial history. And therefore, I think in order to correct this wrong and in order to provide in the way that I think is necessary, and because we have a responsibility to do so, is to hear from voices that have been impacted and not voices that are learning about it third hand. Include these voices, include their history, which is why I'm such a huge advocate of storytelling. Because if we don't tell our stories, someone else will tell our story for us. And most likely it's not correct. And most likely it's quote unquote watered down or whitewashed so that the protagonist and the hero are never us. And once again, that perpetuates all of the xenophobia and the issues that we have surrounding the very issues we keep seeing time and time again, because they're not addressed. I had spoken to a grade school teacher a couple years back, and it just happened to be on Columbus Day. And so I had asked her, I said, so what did you tell your students about Indigenous Peoples Day, stolen land, broken treaties? And she said, but Columbus discovered America. And I said, which America? There's even more than one America. So that within itself, I think is very ethnocentric, to just assume America is us when there's South, Central, Latin America in existence. So that tells me there's still a lot of work to be done. And any chance that we get to provide that as a learning moment or a teaching moment is necessary. Once you are equipped with that information and knowledge, we have a responsibility to share that with others.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a question in the chat for you. So regarding Executive Order 9066, a colleague who grew up in Kentucky mentioned he learned in school that the internment camps were needed and actually good for America. So did you hear similar things from others who learned of a very different experience of the Vietnam immigrant or refugee experience?
So I see Clarence's comment. Thank you so much for asking. That's very profound. So I'll try to encapsulate it in the best way that I can. Again, I believe that stories are primarily written by the victors and primarily written by those who have the power, always. So as far as the Vietnam War in particular, the first time I had heard about it, I can recall, it was in a history book in grade school in 4th grade. And literally, it was 2 sentences in the book. And it said that Vietnam won the war. And so I thought, as a young child, I thought, oh, that's cool. We won the war. That's great. Unbeknownst to me at the time was that we didn't win the war. Nobody won that war. Anyone who was directly impacted in a humanitarian way did not win the war. There were lives lost, there sex assaults were going on, children were abandoned, children became orphaned, lands were completely annihilated. It was an unbelievable and extraordinary situation that I would not constitute as winning in any stretch of the imagination. And so I've heard from people when I speak at different events, pre-COVID, of course, and I see people in the audience who ask questions as, well, it's good that the United States went into Vietnam, otherwise you wouldn't be here, kind of situation, and of course it goes back to the whole saviorism mentality that I think really belittles and really dilutes and minimizes our own experiences as to why we left. I think it's a huge disservice to provide that perspective, because saviorism basically means that you are automatically othering someone. You're minimizing another group already because you feel like you're the center of the story, that you're always the one that is making that positive contribution or impact. So that needs to be eradicated. That mindset needs to be eradicated, again, by reading stories. We have many resources now, whether through film, documentaries, books written by Asian authors, refugee authors, immigrant authors. I can provide a whole list of things that folks can watch. There was a series by Ken Burns called The Vietnam War. It's a 5-part series, I believe, and huge time commitment. So if you don't have a lot of time, make sure you allot that to watch that series. But it tells about all sides of it. And I love the fact that they interviewed people who were communists, people who were not, like my family and I, those who served, those who regretted serving, and the lies that were told to us in that the US was there to save us. When we knew after classified documents were declassified, we were very low on that priority. In fact, when I saw the document with my own 2 eyes, we were less than 10% of the priority of why the United States went into Vietnam. So the truth needs to be known because the truth is important. And a lot of those truths lie in our own histories, which are so important to share and ensure that they're never forgotten.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. And that actually brings up another point that I wanted to kind of ask as a follow-up to that. And I believe you touched on it briefly in your talk as well. And it's the fact that a lot of reasons why we have refugees who are trying to leave their countries, go somewhere else, and specifically America, is sometimes a direct result of American policies, like the Vietnam War. So when someone made the comment to you like they did, it does kind of gloss over that, they're not there for necessarily moral reasons. And it's not just Vietnam, right? It's also like huge, like many countries in the Middle East as well. Like refugees trying to escape there, but the region has been greatly destabilized by a lot of United States policies. So do you think that acknowledging that is an important part of getting justice and making the ability for refugees and immigrants to travel freely? Is that an important part of the discussion, do you think?
I believe that the military-industrial complex and the U.S. role in that is something that I think people don't talk about enough, or it feels so, it just feels so obscure, and it feels so big of a topic to understand about the U.S. investing into developing countries and having a hand in the destruction of their homeland in that way. I love that question. I think it's necessary I love your question for 2 reasons. One, it gets to the core of why wars happen, is people don't leave. Refugees and immigrants, we don't leave because we want to. We leave because we have to. Just like the Japanese internees left because they had to. They didn't want to leave their homes, sell their businesses in a few days. That was not something we ever want to be put in. The circumstances forced us to leave situations that were created not by us, but by people who had a hand and involvement in causing that situation. And so I think it's a fair question to say in that, should we make this something that is widely known? What is our role in educating others on that other component to why people are displaced? There's so many reasons, right? There's climate change, there's persecution, there's violence, there is war. And one of the main countries that are fleeing right now, of course, Myanmar, that used to be Burma, and it's one of the top countries in the world right now. I mean, we currently have over 26 million refugees in the world right now that are stuck on refugee camps. And no one's talking about the details of that, of why people left. And it's important to talk about the root of displacement. And if you were to add in the fact that there's over 80 million people who are displaced, whether internally or externally from their home countries, that's a large portion of the population in the world right now. And so to have that understanding and to make these issues closer to home is really important. I hear all the time, oh, the Vietnam War was a long time ago. Oh, that happened generations ago. But I bet if it happened to them, they wouldn't say that. I bet if it happened to their family, they wouldn't make a musical out of it and call it Miss Saigon and make a mockery out of my experience with doing jazz hands from the worst atrocity that happened to me and my people. I bet they wouldn't say that. I bet you the 9/11 survivors would not say that it happened too long ago, that we need to forget about it. So with that said, I think there's a humanitarian component that's severely missing, and we need to make that known.
Yeah, definitely. We have another question from Clarence in the chat. How can AAPI show up in our communities that are less diverse? And how can our allies, Black, Latinx, Caucasian, etc., show up better and unify? This is a pretty big question, but what are your thoughts on it?
I love this question. Clarence, I love that you're so active in the chat too. Thank you so much for doing that. For me, when I advocate, I'm very intentional of just not focusing on one group, because like I mentioned in my talk, it affects a lot of different communities. And as you know, Asians are not viewed as being highly active in social activism to begin with. And so to bolster our message and to show that solidarity, it's important to also support other communities with very similar situations. And I'll give you a great example. And Dylan, you were there this is at the rally at the JACL facility, in Aurora. I know you were there when we were there to oppose the new ICE director, who it was a Vietnamese refugee, by the way, who wants to deport other refugees and immigrants. So of course that was an opportunity for us to speak out. But there was so much solidarity there. There was the Latinx community, there were Black communities, white communities, Asian communities were there, because we knew at the end of the day, wrong is wrong. It doesn't matter what it looks like or what shape it takes. I will call out wrong if they look like me. I will call out wrong if they're a refugee like me, because that's the right thing to do. We must stand up against it, because if we stay silent on it, we're basically saying it's okay. Go ahead and speak this untruth. And even though we recognize the devastation and just negative impact it can have on these communities, because when we talk about it in theory about advocacy, it doesn't seem like it impacts people. But if we sit down and say, actually, that's happening to me, you're impacting people that look like me by not allowing people entry into the United States. You're impacting people like me for saying that immigration is a horrible thing, that they shouldn't be allowed. And then I think the best thing to do is arm yourself with the facts. When I tell them, refugees are the most vetted human beings on the planet. In fact, I was more vetted as a refugee than I was when I worked in Homeland Security. Just to let you know, I was vetted more as a 3-year-old than I was when I worked in Homeland Security, because I was such a threat at age 3, obviously. But to give you the context of the misinformation and the disinformation surrounding issues that impact lives, we need to ensure that that's the louder voice.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of tie that question into another series of recent events, has been a lot of talk in the media recently about hate crimes and other just general aggression against Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and just the fact that it's partially because of COVID, it's just skyrocketed so much, and there wasn't a lot of reporting on it going on, but there's a lot of renewed interest in it. And there was the one video that was the elderly man who was pushed down in I believe Oakland or the Bay Area and died from his injuries. So that was kind of it was just very clearly documented, like violence against our communities. And I know there's also been a lot of discussion about the fact that the assailant was Black, that we didn't want to contribute to any anti-Black sentiment that's going on. And something that I've been seeing a lot of being reported is the communities in Oakland kind of stepping up for themselves, both Asian and Black, and kind of forming like this kind of inter-community solidarity, where it's like, yeah, we want to look out for each other. We want to, protect each other and not like cause a wedge between our two communities.
It's an extremely pertinent question and very relevant to even beyond the pandemic. It just exasperated it since the pandemic, in my personal opinion. But you make a great point in that when we hear things, when you see crimes against people of color committed by people of color, the automatic go-to and the knee-jerk reaction is to blame that community. Again, the root cause of why that's happening is not being addressed. And we all know it boils down to white supremacy, the dismantling of these oppressive systems. That's why Rodney King riot happened. And with the Korean markets that were being destroyed and vandalized at the time, there was this distrust amongst even people of color against each other. And I think that is we're slowly turning the tide on that when we see the unity of Asians and Blacks, which really filled my heart, really, because I thought, no, we don't need any more divisiveness. We don't need to have any more division in our communities, because we are all experiencing this in one form or another, whether through health disparities, violence, unarmed being unarmed and being murdered by law enforcement. We're all experiencing it in some capacity. Do I wish that we had more coverage and visibility on this? Absolutely. Which is why along with groups of Asian American leaders in Colorado and even beyond, we've been trying to make this issue something that's going to be on the forefront for elected officials and not just an afterthought. So I really appreciated members of Congress like Judy Chu and Ted Lieu and Grace Meng, who have taken initiative to say enough is enough. Okay, we need to get the Department of Justice in here to prosecute these crimes, but we also need local communities to come together and recognize that we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. But more importantly, I think, is our unified message, which I share with them as well, is we need to come together. This is the time to come together, because these crimes did not just crop up overnight. It was a percolation of so many issues historically, with the model minority myth that goes on, which we all know is pegging us against other people of color so that they don't feel as though, one, we're part of their group, or that two, we still have challenges in our communities that still need to be resolved within our own communities. So any opportunity, and to your question, Dylan, as well as Clarence's question, is that if we want others to show up for our community, we need to show up for their communities. That only makes sense to me, and that makes sense to, I think, just human nature in general. When you see someone there all the time supporting you on the things that you feel are important, they don't even have to be social justice issues. They could be any issue that you care about. You're going to have an inclination to want to support them in times of crisis or even times of peace. So if we want them to be better allies, we need to be better allies. And I highly support going beyond our comfort zone to do that. I talked to one of your board members, Gary, recently, who is phenomenal. He's just wonderful. Gary, if you're on the line, my husband and I are big fans of yours, by the way. I just want to let you know we're like fangirling over you. So I want to share that we were talking about just something that a couple of people had mentioned when they were just watching some of the things in the community. And one of the biggest compliments that I have heard was that someone told me, "Now your social advocacy isn't just about Asians. Your social justice advocacy isn't about refugees. It's about everyone." And so when I hear that, I know I'm doing the right thing because that's what we all need to do. And I have to be cognizant of that too, to move that comfort zone so that we can move the needle a little bit further for all of us. Because when one of us moves forward, we all move forward, you know, even if it takes a little longer than other groups, we all need to move forward.
All right, so we have another question in the chat from Elizabeth, who, by the way, is doing a phenomenal job right now as our moderator in the chat. What do you think that President Biden needs to do to advocate for social justice? Do you think he can or will do it?
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your question, and thank you for being here with us today. I'm in the mindset that it doesn't matter if you have a D, an R, or an I after your elected official name. You're all accountable. And to say it in theory and to support us with words is perfectly fine. But I'm beyond that. I want to see some action. I want to see that when you support us, that you have legislation and you have laws and you have initiatives that are going to move us forward. By just saying that you support someone, you know, refugee admissions is not a spectator sport. It's not for sitting back and waiting until something exciting happens. You have to engage. You have to engage. And so as far as what President Biden needs to do for us, when he says that he supports anti-Asian legislation or hate crimes, how does that look? I want to know how that looks. Are you going to deploy more resources into our communities? Are you just going to write a letter of support? Because letters of support, I don't think helps people who are getting assaulted in the streets. I would like to see more action. I'm at that stage of, I've seen words of support, but in action, it means more to us and it actually makes a difference. So it definitely needs to be taken further than just verbal support. I would like to see whether it's community resources as far as contacts to the community, how to engage more, you know? I mean, historically, quite honestly, particularly in Colorado, elected officials haven't been all that engaging with us on a regular basis. They are engaging, but not to the level that they are with other issues. I feel as though it's overlooked and easily overlooked. And so I think it needs to be a symbiotic relationship where we need to engage, but then they also need to engage and show to us through action how that can be done. I guess because I have seen it done so ineffectively with just words, I want to ensure that our community is really answered to and valued in that way, where actions are being taken to improve the lives of those who are impacted.
Yeah, definitely. Because when we, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, when we ask for action for politicians, it's not as though they're, you know, not capable actors. It's like they make the laws, they give the money and the resources, like they have the power to change it. And that's true of both local leaders and going all the way up to the Biden administration.
There was a local activist that I have a lot of admiration for. She's still an undocumented immigrant, and there was a celebration of one of the bills that had been moved forward and codified, and people would go up there and thank you, Senator so-and-so, thank you, Representative so-and-so. She had the best response. She said, "I don't think any of those people, we fought for this. We fought every step of the way to put this in front of their desk, on top of their desk, to ensure that they don't forget about us. We're doing all the work. We're the ones that are doing the grassroots organizing. We're the ones that are rallying up people." So that's just the end result of all the hard work that we've seen. So I just thought that was a great response as far as being accountable to the communities you're supposed to be serving.
Yeah, big agree on that. So I had a question about something you brought up in your talk briefly that I think runs a very interesting parallel to something in the Japanese American community. And it's I was curious about your work on looking into Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam, because you mentioned the long-term health aspects of using that chemical during the war. And I think the one thing that came to my mind was the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Because it was unclear at the time, but there's a lot of evidence that seems to suggest that the fallout from those two attacks is still, aside from the initial devastation of the blast, is still having negative health impacts on people in the community today. So yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that work you did.
No, thank you for asking about that, because again, because we didn't write the history books back then, it's not mentioned. Therefore, I'm trying to fill in the gaps to make sure that people have a comprehensive perspective, and then you make the decision at the end of the day to what you can sit with as far as what the truth is. Because I always tell people, if you're uncomfortable with hearing the truth, then you're hearing it exactly how it should be heard. But if you're comfortable with hearing history, then you're not paying attention. There's something going on that you're not paying attention to if you feel good about what has happened in the United States history. So in response to your question about Agent Orange, it's the toxic biochemical that was dropped during the Vietnam War. And that spanned across years. I mean, it was one of the longest wars of that time. And it was under 5 different administrations that could have done something correct for us. 5 different presidential administrations. And people may be surprised to know, but the one who actually allowed for that to happen and issue an executive order to do that was President Kennedy. I know he's revered as a hero for a lot of people, but once I found out that truth, I thought there's so much of this that is never told that really needs to be heard. I believe there were 20 million tons dropped during that time. And if you can imagine that being dropped by planes at the time and just dousing the environment. So again, I didn't learn about this until probably during my early college days, because there were no reason. It wasn't something that was highly talked about or even accessible during that time, because people don't want to remember the war in that way. They don't want to remember it in these horrific ways. And so I had the honor of going back to my homeland and visiting some of these sites and going to one of the centers of the Christina Noble Children's Foundation. And I did not even appreciate the magnitude of the detriment it had caused until I went there in person to see it for myself. So at the center, and it's just one of over 100 children's centers that this incredible Irish woman named Christina Noble, there's a film about her called Noble that talks about her life. And if you think that is incredible what she's done for our country, for my country, you should find out what happened with her in her actual personal life. It's incredible, all the adversity she's gone through. So we went to the children's center, and there are different levels in the center. And on the bottom of the center in the basement, it's where the nursery is at, where the newborns are at. And usually, from what I understand, when you go into orphanages that have newborns, it's going to be pretty loud. The kids are crying, they're colicky and they're crying. But the moment that I went in there, complete silence. It was very eerie to walk into a room and full of babies, infants, and not hear anything. And I gravitated to the corner of this room, and there are a couple of children who are laying there. And one was just reaching out to me, so I held her. And then she quit crying. She was crying a little, and then she quit crying. And one of the nurses came by, and fortunately, I'm fluent in Vietnamese, so that helped out a lot as far as communication. And I said, is she okay? I mean, how is she doing? And I said, how old is she? And I thought in my mind, she was maybe 10 months old, 11 months old. She didn't look like she was old enough to walk yet. And they told me she was 4 years old. And that really had an impact on me as far as what that does, the impact of it decades later from the war that people are not talking about, because there's a misconception that when the military and the army leaves that situation, we're good. It's all good. Everything's fine. They don't need any more help. And that could be further from the truth. So when I learned about that, I also learned about just the generational impact it has, and how when you don't have the resources to move from those areas, and it's predominantly off of the Mekong River where Agent Orange was dropped, when you don't have the resources to move, you are basically condemned to that area where you're growing your vegetables and your produce and your crops, unbeknownst to you how contaminated that soil is. So you ingest it, and then women give birth, and then children have severe issues, physiological, psychological damage that has been done. And I didn't hear that being spoken about in Miss Saigon. I saw jazz hands, and I saw people laughing and, picturing us like a bunch of prostitutes, who are just dying to meet a GI, an American soldier. So it's very problematic the way things are portrayed when we ourselves are not telling the stories.
Yeah. And that does kind of speak to like all the invisible kind of scars that are left in the forms of trauma, even if it's not visual, like necessarily reflected in your health. It's also, what you carry with you mentally and emotionally.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. To see it firsthand was something else. I think everyone needs to experience something that up close and personal to really recognize just even 2% of what had happened. I really think that's important. And I love the fact that you have this event every single year to ensure that this is something that is on the forefront of people's conversations and their thoughts, and that we revere their resilience and their will to live and their capacity to just fight like hell, like all of those powerhouses, like I mentioned, and so many more, like Minoru Yasu, who incredible. His legacy is incredible, and that their efforts weren't done in vain. We need to make sure that needs to be carried on.
Yeah. And that actually ties in pretty nicely with the question that we got asked in the chat, and it's from Peggy. Do you think there needs to be more solidarity within the local Asian community, and what do you think needs to be done to build greater solidarity? And I think that's a very important point to bring up, especially regarding your earlier point about how the model minority myth, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous is like it does kind of erase a lot of real problems that the AAPI community as a whole faces, and a lot of it can be disaggregated between like regions. For one, like you're from Vietnam, I'm from Japan, and the way that our histories kind of are both intertwined and kind of how they exist here in America are different. So what do you think the answer to this question is?
Peggy, hi, hello. It's been so long. Peggy was a mentor when I was on Auraria, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. I feel so honored that you're asking this question to me. So as far as, do I think there needs to be more solidarity with the local Asian community, and what should we do? I don't think there's ever enough solidarity. It's like chocolate to me. I don't care how much you give me in chocolate, whatever form it takes, I'll take it. I just feel like we all benefit from it, and to say that I'm Vietnamese, you're Japanese, someone is from India, someone from Bangladesh, I think that's a recognition of our uniqueness, but that should be a strength to unify us even more, because if we relate on that common denominator, I feel like our efforts are not only amplified tenfold, but we have a mutual unspoken understanding of our experiences that we have shared in the past maybe I'm an anomaly, but I always am more drawn to people with some sort of background that is a lot different from mine. I'm very drawn to that. The minute I see someone speaking a different dialect, a different language, eating different foods, interested, that I'm very drawn to that, because now I know that I'm in that capacity where it can be a learning moment for me, and how can I utilize that to better bring everyone together. So in response to your question, Peggy, is that to have a good friend, we need to be a good friend. So if we want support from others, we need to start showing up for others. For instance, if there are events going on in our community, encourage people from different ethnicities, encourage our own communities to show up. That needs to be at the forefront of our efforts. I know that there's this concept today of cultural appropriation. People are really hesitant to get involved with some communities because they're thinking that they're overstepping and that they're not supposed to be there. But dispel some of these misconceptions and be engaging and inviting and warm to other groups who, quite honestly, can be these unexpected allies that we never even imagined. I mean, I had, like I said, GOP leaders who were supporting us, who I did not think anything would come out of when I went to Capitol Hill just 2 years ago. And to me, that was phenomenal. That was something that I didn't expect to happen, but that had I not done it, that would have been a missed opportunity and my fault for not making the effort to do so. I gave people this example most recently where I said, I know we would all love to be in a room filled with people. I mean, the audience filled to the brim with people who agree with us. Oh, nah, this is great. I agree with you, nah. Yes, of course, nah. But that doesn't change anything. It's only when we speak to people who don't agree with us and have different mindsets that change happens, because we can use all the allies we can get. So we need to be cognizant of our efforts and ensure that people, one, understand that they should be there, but that two, that we need to show up as well. Because like I mentioned with the presidential administration, words are great. Words are great to hear, but I need that to play out in action, because we need to be that model of what we want to see other people do as well.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I was thinking here locally in Denver about recent efforts, specifically regarding our history around our Chinatown district, or rather our lack of a Chinatown district. Because I think a lot of people in the chat probably know, there was a very, very severe race riot that happened in 1880 that destroyed Chinatown and ended up with one Chinese man killed. And yeah, it's like those kind of struggles, and you look at that and you think sometimes, like, well, that could have easily been like a Japanese community, because sometimes when people see an Asian person, they're just like, they don't necessarily make the distinction in their head, or nor should they, but or around like violent sentiment. So yeah, I think understanding that there is that kind of shared understanding, there are those shared struggles, is very important.
Absolutely. And while everyone else was trick-or-treating on that day, because it occurred on October 31st, it was also the first major race riot in Colorado that is glossed over again. It's completely glossed over. And the way that it's been coined is that we had to be rescued from that situation, as opposed to, no, we were standing up to something that was very wrong, that targeted people based upon the way that we looked and our race. That was what the roots of the event, of why it erupted the way that it did. And so it's important too, I think, for people to understand that it's not so hypothetical, and that these landmarks that we see are there for a reason. And I'm really happy to hear that some of these efforts are being done by some of the local Asian leaders in our community as well, to preserve that history, so that it's not just an afterthought, that it's not just one placeholder in the big scheme of things. It's going to be a living, breathing, relevant part of history. And so I really, really appreciate that. I agree with Clarence, move the plaque, yep. And to have it much bigger than the plaque, because I think, maybe I'm just partial, but I think Asians should be represented more than just a plaque in Colorado. I think our presence has been here enough, and it seems like a constant struggle to make sure that our presence is known and our contributions and the legacy of so many are honored in that meaningful way. It just seems like a constant struggle.
Yeah. So we have another question in the chat from Tracy. I'm biracial, Latina, and Caucasian on a lifelong learning journey to be a meaningful ally. How can allies share stories with permission and be sensitive to ongoing trauma and re-traumatizing?
Great question, Tracy. Thank you for joining us. And I love the fact that you're an ally for us as well. So I appreciate the question. How can allies, and I guess you're asking for yourself and for others like you who want to move with these efforts. So one of the things that we do as storytellers on the Colorado Refugee Speakers Bureau that I'm part of is to ensure that we are in a space where, again, we're not re-traumatizing ourselves and the information that's shared isn't re-traumatizing us. So in order to do that, I think best practices is to first get the permission of the person before you're sharing something so personal, even if it's a public forum. Because as much as I've told my story and as much as I public speak, it's extremely difficult sometimes. I get emotional when I'm having to talk about the xenophobia that we experience or the way that my parents were treated as very dehumanizing. People didn't want to even get near them because they saw them as these dirty refugees and just scapegoating us for the fact of their, due to the fact of their own hardships and things like that. I still get very emotional, and even describing the day that we left was extremely emotional for me because it's a very unique experience in one regard, but so many went through that experience as well. So make sure, and you asked with permission, so how can you be more sensitive? Ensure that what you're sharing is centered around that person. Don't make it into another story that is surrounded by saviorism or that they're not the ones that are going to be kept in mind when you're telling the story, because they should always be the protagonist. They should always be the center of your message. And to not center upon them is a disservice. And I've seen that happen so many times with people telling other people's stories, is that they forget that this is a real human story you're talking about, and make sure that they're not being minimized or being tokenized in some way when you're telling this story as well. Before we go on to the next question, there's an image that I want to show because Courtney, our fabulous tech person, is behind the scene. And if we can show image 1 very quickly, I'd like to share that photo. So if you take a look at this image, it's, as you can see, a small child, a toddler that's being passed from a rickety old ship to what seems like an American ship. I left Vietnam as a refugee, very close in age to this child in the photo, and I was also passed from one ship to the next. As you can see, a lot of things could have gone wrong in this photo. And to have this situation replicated in this image that I had gone through was very emotional when I had seen this, just this picture that really depicted that situation at the time. You can remove the photo if you like as well, so we can go back to the conversation. But that just tells you that that's never mentioned in history. That's never mentioned about losing lives along the way. That doesn't tell you about the thousands of lives that were lost at sea. That doesn't tell you about the lives that remained under re-education camps under the communist regime. So I really think that, again, if you have these stories, and if your family have these stories, they have these stories, make sure they're heard in the most authentic way, because that's the only way that change is going to happen. We cannot have the same narrative, the wrong narrative, dictating and being that louder voice for our own history.
Yeah. Now, do you know when that photo was taken?
I don't, but it was just so startling when I was looking for photos to use. I ran across it a couple years ago and thought, this is one amazing because it's an aerial view. It's taken pretty high up, so probably a helicopter of some sort. And I thought, wow, there's so many of these images that are captured along the way that are never spoken about. I wish more people would know more, and just even the violence that occurred on the boats. I mean, a lot of people thought that we were safe once we landed on a boat, but we were robbed by sea pirates. There were women who were sexually assaulted. People were robbed of all of their belongings. And, we were only able to bring just a few of our most valuable possessions with us. And that was even stolen. Everything from photos to heirlooms to the most precious things that you can take with you were all taken. And then meanwhile, the women were sexually assaulted as well on the boats. So again, that's never talked about.
Yeah. So again, like if you have any questions for Nat, please put them in the chat. I did have another question for you that's kind of been a central theme through your talks, and I think through all of these questions as well, and it's about the idea of proving your Americanness, specifically for refugees and immigrants and people who were just did not grow up in America, or and I think there was a post earlier on that pointed to your TEDx talk titled "A Civilization is Colonization," and it's a very interesting talk because it's what you know now after your life experiences and what you've learned in your work. And I'm kind of curious, like how that, for a lot of us, how that thought process evolves from when you're a child to when you're an adult, having come from a different country.
Thank you for that question. I don't think my experience is unique, but I will speak upon it on a personal level so that there can be a more meaningful understanding of this process. A couple years ago, I gave a talk about, I guess I should give a title to it because I keep referencing back to it. I guess it's called the American Checklist. That's what it's called. So basically, I tell people when we arrive, there's expectations of us as newcomers, as people who obviously don't look like we were born here, that are a little different, that have been othered. And so there is this arbitrary checklist that is placed upon us. And it's funny because when they go down the list, like for instance, and I give examples like be a US citizen. Okay, check, I've done that. Speak English, and I said, okay, check. I even have advanced degrees, so that's check. I've done that, and I've even written scholarly journals to Ivy League universities that have been published. So I think my English, from what I know, is all right. It's very understandable so I think I checked that list. And then the other one was be patriotic, and I tell them, well, I've served in Homeland Security to protect this nation. Doing counterterrorism, counterintelligence work, I would say that's a check as well. And then be productive individuals is another one that's required of us. And I name off the list of the things that I've done. And then it's, it just one checklist after another, one thing after another. And yet I still get people saying, go back to where you came from. Why don't you change your name to something I can pronounce more easily? You're not patriotic enough if you don't, I don't know what I'm supposed to, I've checked off all of the items that I'm supposed to check off as a refugee. And so at the end of my message, I basically said, it doesn't matter how many items you checked off as a refugee or immigrant. We'll never be fully accepted because these checklists are created by the dominant society to other us even more, to differentiate even more. And it's funny because I tell them, you're telling me that I need to speak English when I arrive to this country. And I think I mastered the language. I don't know, maybe I haven't. I think I mastered the language, but I'm asking them to pronounce my name, which is just one syllable, and they can't even do that in my language. So to me, I feel like this exceptionalism to require this from us and no other group that looks like them, we know why. We know why this is happening. They're not expecting that from, some person who is completely okay with being mediocre, who looks like them. But they expect all of these things from us because we're different, and they demand these sorts of things from us. So there's a great quote that says something like, the rights of the Constitution and the right to exercise it, including mediocre, should be available for everyone, including people of color. If we want to be mediocre like everybody else, we should have the right to do that. And I thought that was great. I thought that was great because it's, why are you placing these expectations on me and all of a sudden not you? You don't have to meet it, or people who look like you don't have to meet it. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, it definitely rings true. And a lot of this question is rooted in, I think a lot of what our families, for those who were incarcerated, kind of went through. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of pressure to kind of prove that you're American and you support the country, even though for a lot of people who ultimately ended up being incarcerated, America was the only country that they ever knew. Like, their families might have been from Japan, but they grew up in America. But again, yeah, it wasn't enough because they didn't look white. And there's also there was a lot of discussion. Like, once during incarceration, there was the infamous questionnaire that was brought up. That all incarcerated were required to fill out, where it basically asked, one, will you serve America against the fight in Japan? And two, do you renounce any loyalty towards the Emperor of Japan and swear loyalty to the United States? And it's like, well, what loyalty do we have to the Emperor? I mean, we've never lived in Japan. And the fact that there was a lot of resistance within the camps towards not only this questionnaire, but also the idea of serving in the military of a state, of a country that imprisoned them.
No, absolutely. I think it's such a tone-deaf question. It just minimizes your role and your experiences of being here your entire life and not even having any sort of any kind of tie with in that way, right, to Japan. And so again, because it's not written by us, it doesn't represent our mindset or even what our beliefs are. I mean, I get those questions a lot, that I just realize that they don't quite understand. They don't understand why, for instance, why it's important to me that I keep my native language. Things like that I hold very, very dear to me, oh, English only. And yes, English is important because you can utilize it as a tool. But I always tell people, Vietnamese are chopsticks and English are fork and knife. I'll always have a deeper connection to what I have been connected with from the onset. And I recognize I need that fork and knife for my steak, for my New York strip. I need that in order to complete the task at hand. But there's a clear differentiation as to the role of both and what that plays into my life. So in the bigger scheme of things, our own personal identity is always going to be significant, at least it should be to us. And everything else, I think, is a necessary tool in order for us to be able to operate in the bigger society and the functioning society as a whole.
Right. And that actually, you just got me thinking of something else, which is this is a very personal question for me, and I think a lot of people my age who are AAPI might be going through a similar thing. Is the idea of cultural loss, like the idea that we feel a little, we feel somewhat disconnected from our heritages, our cultures. And I wonder, do you have any, I guess, advice for people who might be in this chat, who might be feeling a little disconnected from where they come from? Maybe it's weighing kind of heavily on their shoulders. From your experience.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I know it's a struggle for a lot of folks because we're not in our home country. We're in another nation. And because it's something that is not readily accessible to us on a daily basis, it only becomes jarring when we have days like this, days of remembrances, or the day of the fall of Saigon, or the October 31st on the Chinese riots, when we have those indicators to remind us of what it is that we're missing or what it is that we're losing. So I love the fact that you're even mentioning this, Dylan, because I wish people would even mention the question and even express the interest to their own ethnicity and to their own identity. But I think for me, the way that I've been able to maintain it in the way that I do, of course, it stems first from my family. My parents were avid supporters of saying, nope, Vietnamese at home, English when you walk out the door, because you're going to be speaking English day in, day out. You don't need to be speaking it here. And of course, we didn't like it when we were younger. We were fighting it all the way because it's not cool to be that kid who spoke multiple languages. It wasn't cool. So of course, as we get older, there are things that, I say this in my TEDx talk, it's the intangible items that are most important to us and not the tangible items. And one of those things is language and heritage. But what I would encourage you to do is to watch, read, listen, attend anything, absolutely anything that has anything to do with your culture or remotely close to your culture, and engage in those communities on a regular basis, because there is something so fulfilling of being in that space where you're talking about these meaningful things with people who also appreciate it to the level that you do. And there's something so fulfilling that feeds your soul when you know this is exactly the conversations that your ancestors would have loved for you to have. And it fills my heart, it fills my soul. And I feel like the more often that you talk about it, the more that you engage in it and the more that you just completely embrace it and just completely submerge yourself in it in any way that you can, I think it's going to help you out in every regard. Because as you know, the more that we appreciate our own culture, the more we appreciate other people's culture. And I think that's a serious defect for a lot of people in the United States. They don't know their ancestry, so of course they're not going to appreciate mine. It begins with you. It begins with knowing who you are, appreciating where you came from. I'm going to make up something really outrageous. If I was born on Mars, and I didn't know I was born on Mars, and I thought, oh, maybe I was born on Saturn, or maybe Mercury, I don't know, one of those planets. I'm not sure, but I never did the research, so who cares? So someone's talking about, oh, I'm from Neptune, it's beautiful, and we celebrate this from Neptune, and that. I'm like, okay, that's nice. But imagine if I actually had the humility to listen to them and the humility to find out about where I came from. All of a sudden, we're connecting on such a profound level that now I'm able to not just hear, but actually listen to what's important to them. So with that, I really encourage you to do that, to actively engage in however way that you can. And even beyond even Japanese, if you want to engage in other Asian communities, I just think that makes it, I feel like that is a nod to your ancestors. It's a nod to you, and it's a nod to the future that's relying on you to retain your culture. So no pressure, Dylan, but definitely engage. and I also want to say this too, is that one way you can do this is to advocate. I cannot stress that enough. Advocacy is a way to show that you remember your culture every day, that you remember your identity every day. And to do that, I think it's outward for others to see that this is an important issue, but I think that a part of it is inward as well. I think it feeds your soul and helps you recenter in what it is and what's important to you and who you are.
That's really refreshing to hear. Nah, thank you. So we're coming up on time, but before I did, I wanted to ask, so we got you something as a thank you for the speaker, and I was wondering if you could maybe show it to the chat.
Yes,
if you have it available right now.
Well, yes, of course. I'm carrying it around the house. Are you kidding me? It's beautiful. I've been carrying it around, bragging about it. I'll show that, and then can we end with a photo that I want to share as well? Can we end with it's? I know we don't have that much time. Okay, so
yeah, absolutely.
So this is the sculptural award that I received. Look how beautiful it is. It's handcrafted by an artist, and it was I was given this honor to receive this award, and Gary was so gracious. I'll keep holding it up. Gary was so gracious to explain the significance of it, and I was listening, and unbeknownst to him, there's a backstory to this that is very meaningful to me that he wasn't aware of, is that I'm an origami artist as well. And so I literally, I think I folded over 1,000 cranes. So I think one wish is like on the horizon for me. I get like one wish coming my way at cranes, and I make angelfish and stars, and my whole collection is available at a local shop here called Ruby's Market, a handcrafted crane by Calvin Noguchi. So I gave the backstory, but I tell you this is because it has so much significance to me, because I already have a very special place in my heart for origami and Japanese artwork. So to receive this was just extremely meaningful. So I want to thank everyone with Mile High JCL, Dylan, Gary, I don't know who's on the line. I can't see everyone. I know Gil, and I know there are others, but I can't see you. So I apologize, but it is an extreme honor to share this significant day. But also to know that we're more similar and alike than different. Despite the fact that I came over as a boat person, despite the fact that I came over as a refugee, and I stayed on 2 refugee camps and had to acclimate in every way to come to the United States, I have such a kinship with your experiences and your history, and it makes it elevates it to a whole other level when I know that I'm invited to be part of this day. So I want to, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank everyone and all of the attendees that are here today, and everyone who supported us and supported this event.
Thank you, Na. It's an honor to have you here. It really is.
Thank you. And I want to read this because handcrafted by Calvin Noguchi, extremely talented. I don't know. Let me see. I don't know any more information than that, but it's beautiful. It's very delicate looking. And I was holding it, and I probably shouldn't be carrying around the house like this. It's pretty delicate. But thank you so much. And would you be okay with ending it on a photo? Could we go to photo number 10?
Yeah.
So this photo was taken at the Women's March in 2019. That was a very cold day in January. And I did not intend on speaking at that event. It was a last minute decision. And the significance of this photo, the reason I wanted to share it with you today, is that there was a time when I didn't feel proud of being a refugee, because it connotates something that was so negative and something that is so unwelcomed during the time that we came over. And even now, it doesn't resonate well with people. But I've learned that from everything that I've witnessed, and all of these xenophobic moments and all of these experiences that I've seen, I'm proud that I've overcame all these adversities and hardships. I'm proud of the fact that there's such a huge community of amazing refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, and stateless people. I'm so proud of that. And as you can see on the sign, there's 3 stripes. They should be in red, and the background is supposed to be in yellow. That's the flag I will always recognize from my homeland. That's the South Vietnamese flag before the takeover. So that's always going to be close to my heart. So we can go back to the main screen. Okay, thank you. But I wanted to share that with you. It's captured by a extremely talented friend of mine who's a photographer, professional photographer, Dave Russell. And I don't know how he does it. He always gets it at the right moment, you know. And I tell everyone, anyone could have been holding that sign at that moment and would have looked like a rock star because he's so talented. I just happened to be that person, but anyone could have held that sign and done that. So I want to thank everyone again for having me, and I hope to see all of you and connect with all of you and collaborate and advocate with you. I want to advocate with you. So if there's something you want to collaborate with, please, please, please reach out to me, reach out to the Mile High JACL, and let's do this. I mean, through action. Let's not talk about it. Let's get things done through action.
Definitely. The work continues, right?
Yes.
So yeah, thank you again so much for being with us today. And to all of us still in the chat, thank you for joining Mile High JACL today. I know this is the first year we've done a virtual event. It's not the same as meeting in person and having that sense of togetherness of all being in the same room. But I do appreciate you all making your way here and being here with us today. As my first Day of Remembrance as president, it's been so meaningful having all of you here. And normally this would be the time I tell you can get up and go get food now, but that'll have to wait till next year. I hope we'll have a chance to meet next year. I did want to say one more time, if you do want to help support us or become a member, please go to our website. There's links there if you want to make a donation. And there's also a link there if you want to go become a member. You'll do that through the JACL national site. Help us put programming like this on. I did want to say one really quickly about an event that's coming up in the next couple of months. So because of COVID, the usually scheduled annual pilgrimage to the Amachi concentration camp, which is in southeastern Colorado in Granada or near Granada, is going to be virtual this year, but we do have a team who's working on putting together a virtual pilgrimage to Amachi. So if you would like to attend, if you know anyone who was imprisoned there who would like to attend, that's going to be coming up. I believe there's not a set date yet, but it is, they're aiming for late May, early June, and JACL, Mile High JACL will be helping out with that. So we hope to see you there as well. And again, just a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to Naf for her super inspiring story and insight. To all of the volunteers that are helping behind the scenes and who helped plan and put this together. Thank you. And everyone be well, be good to yourselves and each other, wear a mask, and take care. And we hope to see you again soon.
Dylan, thank you. You did a fantastic job. I really appreciate all the efforts you made and your entire team to have this event happen despite our very unusual situation. So you're a rock star. Thank you so much for doing this. It's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.